We'll present today about game-based pedagogies for future game players. So please warm welcome for Michael Ayres.
Thank you for having me. It's a great honour to be here for somebody that was brought up on total football in the 90s, and also the Dutch hockey team and their consistent success at the Olympics. It's a great honour to have an Englishman present to Dutch coaches and teachers. I have also learnt one thing, that never to go on a bike ride with Jerome in this weather, because you end up getting wet, which is, apologies for the dress code. I've had to slightly strip off to an extent. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Ivo and Jerome for allowing me to do this presentation in honour of Len Almond. Some of you may have come across his name before. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for this man. Len was one of the founding forefathers of teaching games for understanding, and sadly passed away 2 weeks ago. So the model that is in the book, and the adaptive model that is in the book, came about because Len and colleagues at Loughborough University began to consider a different way of teaching and coaching games. And my last conversation with Len, I think, is very apt in terms of today's presentation. Len, even on his deathbed, was sending, I know, colleagues at this university and here and at Loughborough lots of material and lots of his thoughts. And the last the email I got from him was his belief that there was a quiet revolution taking place within youth sport, particularly within invasion games, and that being that this reconceptualisation of how a sports coach and teachers should coach and work with young people, and hopefully we'll touch on some of those aspects today. Just to begin, when I first got approached to deliver this presentation, I felt fairly relaxed, and then a week ago I started reading Dennis Bergkamp's autobiography, and it said about Dutch people knowing exactly what they want, and they know everything. I think he was insinuating. So I felt some pressure now in terms of this presentation. So hopefully you will leave today maybe considering some other aspects of sports coaching and teaching through the game. Just in terms of an overview, I would like to consider some of the models and theories, but not spend too much time on that. Then look at the challenges I think we face as academics and practitioners to embracing and engaging with a game-centered approach. And going back to the original model with this concept of understanding, and how do we develop understanding within ourselves, but most importantly the young people that we work with. And then also give some practical examples. This is not, and I have to frame this is not going to be a presentation that is a war on drills. There's no propaganda to say that drills and isolated technical practices, that there isn't a place for them. There is. And this presentation is about, I guess, for us to begin to consider our own thoughts and perceptions of how we might engage with a game-centered approach. So if we look to your left, the top model, that was one of the first models that was used or developed. And I think really importantly, came out of Loughborough University, but from a very practical basis. So Bunker and Thorpe at the time were physical education lecturers, and with Len Almond's support and guidance, began to develop and write down and actually collect their own reflections on teaching and coaching through the game. Then more recently you had this development in Australia by Richard Lights, who spoke about game sense, and effectively that it's a simplification of the teaching games for understanding model. What both do is place the learner at the heart of how we teach and coach. and then using various pedagogical strategies of how we might adapt, change, and progress the game, we can begin to impact upon the young people within the context of our coaching or teaching session. And then, without going into what my students hate is the boring stuff, the philosophical and the theoretical underpinnings, it's worth considering that probably about 5 to 10 years ago, academics began to try to underpin and rationalise some of these models within a theoretical and philosophical stance. So we talk about the models being constructivist in nature, the ability to look at the learning taking place within situated practices and not isolated, and then more and more evidence around a non-linear approach, the use of the constraints-based model, and more recently the use of the affordance theory within teaching and coaching games. And this is just an overview from a study by Harvey and Jarrett that looked at the different derivatives of the teaching games for understanding approach across the world, and the number of research papers that were being, or number of models that were being researched against. And you can see the various similarities, but also differences in terms of the naming of those models. But what a colleague of ours has undertaken from Spain, they looked at what were the core principles that exist within these models. And the majority of those models and approaches shared some of the similarities. So that was one of the first similarity was the foundations, about the game being playful and the ability to engage in a wide range of games and activities that might have transference across them. So we might engage within invasion games as a generic form of physical education, and the transference there in terms of weight of pass, weight of throw, how we might score, can cut across the different games. But playfulness was a main part of the foundations of the models that have been researched on across the globe. Second is the structure and the progression of those, and how learning is scaffolded through each of those models. And again, I'm aware in the book we talk about, that's been announced today, the levels that are in there and how we scaffold the learning that takes place using a game-centered approach. And that was inherent, again, throughout the majority of the models. Something that we're going to touch on later is around this emphasis around game design and how we design games. I think sometimes we as practitioners are at fault. We have these very tight learning objectives and aims, and we will put in place games or practices that try to get those outcomes to be achieved by the end of the lesson, and we will do anything to achieve those. And we'll consider later on this concept of actually coaching the emerging game and having a slightly more flexible and adaptable approach to how we might coach and teach through games. The majority of the models had this concept of teaching in the game, so using the pedagogical principles of TGFU, of representation, of sampling, of modification within the game were inherent throughout, but also the pedagogical principles of using questioning. If we refer back to the models, that was a fairly significant, important part of those models, the pedagogical strategies that we would use when we teach or coach to try and gain an understanding of what the players are thinking at that particular point. And then we also look at this concept of how we might adapt the games depending on the context. Would a game being taught in a school look slightly different to an elite performance environment? These are some of my thoughts, but also some of the thoughts that are inherent throughout the literature as well. And I think some of the challenges that we have as academics and practitioners. in terms of how we might implement and embrace a game-centered approach. And when I talk about a game-centered approach, I don't mean maybe designing a game at the end of our session. I mean actually embracing those concepts of aligning our pedagogical instructions with the concept of a game that will meet certain outcomes at the end of the session. Hopefully I won't be asked to leave after this point. I think academia has a problem, and I think that is a cultural and historical problem whereby we become obsessed by the models, and the majority of the research looks to test those models. Does this model work compared to this model? Does this approach work compared to this approach? And then what we do is that we then use really complex language that I'm not entirely sure that we even understand to try to explain those differences. And I think we have a moral, philosophical, ethical obligation to translate the research that we're doing into something very practical. So I see that as a fairly significant challenge for those working in academia to begin to do that. If we're going to research around teaching games for understanding, what are the practical implications for that research, and how does that then look like, or what does that then look like, I should say. And then we know from the research, particularly around game-centered approaches, the challenges that practitioners, teachers and coaches face, particularly around what we perceive as learning, and the fact that learning might be different from success. So is it okay if we don't get success at the end of our coaching session or P lesson, but learning has taken place? Big issue around power dynamics and the control that the teacher and coach has over those pupils and over the lesson objectives, and how we can begin to actually realize that relinquishing some of that power will begin to give some of the choice, autonomy and decision making back to the players. Big issue that's come out in the research is around, well, actually, what is a game-centered approach, or what is a game-based approach, and the misinterpretations of that. Traditionally, in England, the coaches will still believe it's a whole process. So we start with a game, we'll in the middle of our session, look to integrate some isolated technique, and then we'll apply it to the game again. For me, that is not a game-based approach. So we have to reconsider, what does that look like? And then finally, I've put this phrase, are we an in or out coach? And I think that goes back to our own philosophical beliefs around how young people learn. And I think it goes back to that point around the power dynamics. Do we believe that we're going to pour the knowledge into the players that we work with, or do we try to get the learning out of the players? And those are two distinct factors, and will ultimately, I think, underpin how we teach and coach, and how we design our sessions, and how we will develop a program throughout the course of a season or a scheme of work. And for me, this is that's the most important part that's missing from the research. What are the needs of the student or the player within the context of a game-based approach? Are we truly meeting their needs? An example I'm going to give here, this is a quote from Joy Butler, who has a long track record of researching around teaching games for understanding. And this concept of the emergent learning. And I think we're all guilty of putting on a lesson or a session and continuing to almost trying to square pegs into round holes approach, whereby we're going to get those session or lesson outcomes whether those young people like it or not, rather than actually, well, I didn't plan for this to happen, but the young people I'm working with have found a solution to the problem that I've posed. Well, we're going to go with that. So I would argue sometimes our planning is too tight and too rigid. Can we look to maybe we want our players to be flexible, adaptable. Well, surely that's what we should be as well. Do we have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the game that we are teaching or coaching to be able to adapt to deal with the emerging game? We will use tactical pillars. So we look at the 3 phases of the game: attacking, defending, and transition, and actually plan just around those 3 areas. And what comes out of that, we will try to deal with. Hopefully, I think this may get the message across. One question: who is the lid?
Training fleas requires a glass jar with a lid. The fleas are placed inside the jar and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behaviour is now set for the rest of their lives. And, when these fleas reproduce, their offspring will automatically follow their example.
Who or what is the lid? I think the lid represents 2 things for me. Who or what is the lid? Who's the lid in this example?
Training fleas requires a glass jar with a lid. The fleas are placed inside the jar and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behaviour is now set for the rest of their lives. And, when these fleas reproduce, their offspring will automatically follow their example.
Yep, so the context, the actual game I think sometimes we design can be the lid, the environment that we create can be the lid. Yeah, I think we are the lid too many times. Whether it's because of our philosophical beliefs, whether it's the way we intervene, whether it's the design that we establish, I think we are the lid. And I think sometimes the game can be the lid. And whose right is it for us to be that lid? If we're working with young people who may come up with creative and innovative solutions to the problem we're solving, to keep that lid screwed on. So I think that will be one of the challenges I would ask of you today is can we begin to not be that lid, to maybe leave the lid off the jar a little, to see what actually materializes from how we teach and coach and the lessons and sessions that we create. If you go into any professional sports club or even any school and this is a key topic at the moment around what does a player look like in 10 years' time. The game has changed so much and it will evolve and change again. This list could go on, and I've just put up some of the characteristics that I think any professional sports club or school would consider. I'm going to make a suggestion that we can't actually develop those qualities when we consistently teach or coach through isolated practice. We can only create a love of the game through actually playing games. We can only hope and develop an environment that will create good decision makers within the context of a game. We can only have players who are maybe curious and inquisitive and to begin to try and find solutions through the context of a game. Yes, they need to be technically able to do those things, but all of those characteristics that we look to develop can only be developed through the context of the game. So moving on, if we now consider this role of understanding, again, going back to some research by colleagues in Germany and in Hong Kong, we look at this concept now of how do we develop players that not only have an understanding of the game, but actually understand what they're doing in the game? How can we develop players that are unusual, that are innovative, that do things that aren't statistically relevant? The amount of performance analysis that takes place in elite sport now, that every team has on every other team, is significant. So the more we can do of that, the top one, the more players we can develop that are able to create innovative solutions, the more element of surprise, the more successful teams and athletes will be. And I think one way of doing that is to try and develop this concept of understanding. I think we've all been there where we've asked questions, we've brought the class or the group in, and we've asked certain students questions, or players questions, and they can verbalise the right answer. They can tell us what the answer we want them to say. But we then ask them to go and put that into practice again, and they can't do it, whether it's maybe technically improficient or whether they actually don't understand how it looks like in the context of the game. And I think that's an inherent throughout lots of the game-based approach models around this concept of understanding. And when we look at if we look at the research around understanding, and we look at it from an education perspective, we come across these different areas. So one around facilitation of understanding, one around how we might develop the concept, and then also how we might develop the framework. I'm conscious that at the moment this is a table full of words. I will try and now translate in a minute what it looks like into practice. But I think it's important that we grasp what understanding might look like from in those three areas. So in essence, understanding is made up of knowledge, but knowledge that is deep and is conceptual and also procedural. And I go back to those comments around the uniqueness of a player's decision making. Are we able to create environments that students, players are able to then apply some of their learning to novel or new situations? And that's why I think sometimes our lessons are too tight. We don't maybe create that environment for that to occur. And then if we look at the work by an education specialist called Grimm, he talks about understanding being, in essence, the ability for a student to grasp and see things, whether that's in a very traditional education sense, in a maths class or an English class, but also on the football pitch or hockey pitch, any other invasion or net and striking games. And when you look at the definitions of grasping and seeing, those are characteristics of players and young people that we want to develop. Are they able to see changes in complex systems or complex environments and then make the appropriate decision to those changes? And then I think the most important thing around the seeing element is, are they able to then anticipate what's going to happen next? We were talking at lunch, the England rugby team had a huge problem. You know rugby? Yeah, it is a very strange game. I don't quite get it still. But there is a rule that takes in place that if you don't engage in the tackle, you can stand in an offside position. And that had never been done before. The Italian team had maybe slightly weaker from a technical and a tactical perspective, saw this hole within the rule and decided to change the game. And there's a fascinating piece, all the rugby referees wear radio mics, and this conversation between the England captain and the referee with the English captain saying to the referee, well, what am I meant to do? Tell me what I'm meant to do. And the referee going, well, you're the player, you need to make the decision to overcome that. And we would suggest maybe that the environment created within training, we're not creating players with that deep understanding. A novel situation occurs, I need to solve that problem. And then finally, as teachers or coaches, how do we establish the pedagogy of understanding that enables students to be flexible and adaptable? How do we give them the power to do that? I think we talk a lot as practitioners around empowerment and allowing those young players we work with to make decisions. But how do we do that? What does that look like? I think that's down to the environment that we create that shifts the power dynamics away from the teacher and coach and gives it to the players. And then finally, I'm going to play a video. This is rugby. For those of you who haven't seen it, I still don't know why, but Leinster Rugby Club is probably the biggest rugby club, maybe bar one team in England, in Europe. They approached the university. They effectively wanted to revolutionise how they coached and the way they coached to a more game-based approach. We've been working with them for 3 years now. We've looked at it from an organisational perspective all the way down to individual coaches. This is what rugby looks like. It's a bit mad.
Well done! Touch it, touch! Oh, here we go!
So this is they have around 50 coaches that work in the schools at performance level and in also local sports clubs as well. Rugby traditionally taught from a very block practice technical perspective, one because of the physical demands, because of the number of contacts, and two just because that's how it's always been.
Let's go, well done.
And yet there's a real shift in rugby at the moment around having less prescribed moves, a bit like American football, to a more open and flexible way of playing the game. And we're now beginning to get anecdotal evidence that that's also having an impact at participation now. So, as an example, the coaching that's been going on in their schools program, where they would have 4 years ago a 50% drop-off from 1 year to the other, they now have 100% retention. The only thing that they can prescribe it to now is their change in coaching methodology. So they purely coach through the game.
Here we go.
And then just the points around the side. These are some of the characteristics that we've begun to identify that make them an organisation that has an inherent learning culture throughout.
All right, touch and go.
One of the key things is that there isn't any hierarchy when it comes to learning. So their chief executive will go out and coach and get one of their assistant coaches to come and observe and feedback. And so you are getting that constant critical dialogue going on, whether you're the CEO or you're new to coaching. And it creates a really vibrant and honest environment that I don't think necessarily exists within sport or education establishments sometimes. But that's the most important thing. Their player development, the development of the player, whether that's from a recreational perspective, a participation perspective, or a performance perspective, is the most important thing to them. They almost want the players to tell the coach what to do. And it's taken a huge shift, particularly within the school settings, to relinquish that power. But in terms of their participation numbers and the way their performance teams are now playing, is bearing some fruit. I have my last slide, and it's a challenge to you. Okay. How many? We have roughly 100 people in the room. Okay. So this is a quote from Bruner. Now imagine the amount of knowledge and understanding in this one room around invasion games, net and wall. It's significant. So, if you do nothing today, can you begin to consider how you might translate your understanding into developing one new game that you'd never designed before, that maybe sits within some of those tactical pillars that we've spoken about, and maybe share it with somebody that you don't know and you haven't met before? There's effectively 100 different games within this room associated to those different sports. Hopefully that way, through collaboration, through sharing ideas, that we can begin to continue this quiet revolution that I think Len was right in saying that is taking place within how we work and teach within physical education and youth sport. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I think we have some time left for, I think this is a microphone, so that's why I'm going to try to throw it to someone. Is there anyone with a question for Michael? Yes. Ja? Ja, kan toch?
That's right, yeah.
What about... Dus een microfoon? Is dit hem? Oh. In het Engels ook nog, hè? Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering about the emphasis on understanding. Does it mean we have also the other revolution for implicit motor learning? And now we're asking question, we come again in our head instead of in our body.
I think it'd be interesting to see what colleagues here think. I think those two are significantly linked. I think one way of developing understanding is through implicit learning and maybe some of the strategies that you would consider, maybe through the use of analogies. I think we develop particularly a deep conceptual understanding through those analogies, and making sure that those implicit learning strategies that we use are relevant to the young people we're working with. I sometimes think when we deliver or establish the environment that allows us to use implicit learning strategies, that they're ours and they relate to us and not maybe relate to the players, if that makes sense. So I think those strategies can be used to develop understanding, but we have to make sure that they're relevant to those the young people's world that we're working with.
Okay, and so can you also implicitly learn tactical? Or
Can you implicitly learn technical?
Or is it by definition a cognitive?
I think there would be an argument to implicitly learn technique if we considered that there is no one technique. We didn't really touch on some of the constraints-based approaches. I think one of the criticisms of that at the moment is the lack of the cognitive element of that approach. And I'm not saying here today that we completely cut that out of our program. What I think we need to consider, I think that's the easy thing to do, teaching technique explicitly through a very cognitive approach, I think is easy for us to do. I think if we had to go and teach or coach a sport that we weren't used to in an environment we weren't used to, I think that's what we would default to. So I think our challenge is how we then maybe relate some of those questions to being creative in our own practice. Have you tried it before?
What did I try before?
So looking at the implicit learning or using implicit learning strategies to...
Yeah, we did a lot, and
yeah.
I also practice it within the police training.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to get them into action and develop their procedural knowledge by doing.
Yeah.
And not by talking so much. So.
Okay. And it worked?
Sometimes it works, sometimes it won't work, depending on the individual.
Okay. Thank you.
One more question, maybe?
I never know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing if nobody asks any questions.
If there's not, I'm
I will take
very
it
curious about your rugby, if I can ask a question. Is rugby unique in this opportunity to change their rules? I mean, it's very depending on the structure and institute that has the opportunity to or give the freedom to the clubs to change their rules, or is it just on a recreational level that they use their own?
Are you referring to the
rugby?
The Leinster example?
Yes. Or is it just local kind of?
Yeah. So in terms of their teachers and coaches are educated through their association, and that's still very much based upon a technical model. So skill drill game, and they see that as fundamentally the easy part to achieve. One of their main reasons for shifting towards a game-based approach was to try and understand what children want. Culturally, they compete against Gaelic games, which is a mixture of football and rugby. And so they saw this as their unique selling point of how they coached. They talk about the Leinster way and a game-based approach being very much part of the Leinster way, but purely to attract and to establish a love of the game for those young people taking part. They realise that not all of them will make it into the elite team or the national side, but they will still need players in their clubs, amateur clubs. They will still need referees. They will still need volunteers. And if you can harness a love of the game through their first experiences, then they perceive a game-based approach as one or as the way of trying to achieve that.
Thank you. I think we have to move on in the program. Just a little present for your...
I think I know what this is.
You cannot open this because I'm going to present.
All right. Okay.
Thank Michael.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you.
This is a book.
Thank you. As long as I can get it signed. Yeah.